that you make or maintain are available to the public by default, with exceptions, and we'll talk to those. So my notes here that I have for this is this is a public record. The notes that I take as I make that presentation, it's a public record. My emails that I send at the Attorney General's office, it's a public record. And so if a member of the public requests them, I have an obligation to respond with responsive records, unless there's an exemption that applies, and we'll get to those. So if you're representing a school committee, I would say you are subject to the Access to Public Records Act. But whether you're subject to the OMA or the Access to Public Records Act, it's not as clear-cut as a lot of issues within these laws. A lot of issues within these laws, I can give you a black and white answer, yes, no. Whether you're subject to these laws is one part of these laws, which is a little bit, it takes more, it's a multi-factor analysis. So there are a lot of entities that come to me where they want to know whether they're subject to the OMA or the APRA. And that would take a lot of time for us to really make an analysis on that and come to a conclusion. So I advise, if you think you might be, you might as well just comply. That way you have nothing to worry about. Let's go through the procedures real quick for the Access to Public Records Act. So each public body must have written procedures for how to seek public records. On a website, if you have one. If not, those procedures need to be easily accessible to the public. And it's, if you look at like really small town websites, I'm from Western Massachusetts, if you look at some of the municipalities' websites, sometimes one of the only things they have really is their procedures for the Access to Public Records Act, because they know this law and they know that these procedures need to be available. So it's really kind of Spartan what's required, but these items still need to be required in the procedures. It must identify the public records officer or the unit. For us, I'm technically the public records officer, but it would be the open government unit. How to make the request, where to make the request, and this is key. There's no requirement that the request be made on the form. So we have a form, the Attorney General's office has a form, but it's not a requirement that the individual uses that form. In fact, we have responded to an APRA request that was submitted on a Post-it note before, so it's really, there's no requirement there. And then, as I said, they should be posted on the public body's website or otherwise accessible to the public. So, this is a common misconception about the APRA. Anonymous requests are fine. And also, you don't need to have a reason. You can request whatever you want, and there does need to be an articulable reason for why you're requesting it. And I've kind of, after responding to hundreds of these in my career, I've stopped trying to figure out why people want the things that they want, because it's a head scratcher. So it's easier to just comply with a law as opposed to trying to figure out what the motivation behind a records request is. So the Access to Public Records Act, it applies to records. So you have no obligation to answer questions, to provide summaries of documents, to create spreadsheets, to do data entry. The one exception to that is if you can create a spreadsheet with a couple clicks. So we have databases that we use at the Civil Division, and I know how to use them, and if I can get the information that the member of the public is seeking through a couple of keystrokes, then I can do that. But if it gets to the point where it's like you're creating an Excel spreadsheet and you're entering data, that is not required of you under the Access to Public Records Act. And you also don't have to answer questions. It's just, do you have the documents, provide the documents. Although, obviously, we try to be as accessible as possible. We aren't sticklers for the rules. If it's something we can answer easily, why not, in the interest of transparency? So, within 10 business days, and this is, so you receive the request, and the clock starts ticking, and you have 10 business days. So that excludes weekends and holidays. And within those 10 business days, there are 3 things you can do. You can extend for 20 more business days. You can deny access to the records, or you can provide the records. So it's kind of 3 rather simple channels, but then, The reason why one full-time employee is basically devoted to this area of the law is because there are a lot of complications that can come through these three channels. We'll get into that. So 10 business days. It needs to be received during the business hours, right? So if we get email requests, if the email comes in at 7:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, that's not day one. Day one is Thursday. When you come into the office and you receive the request, you start your calculations on that Thursday. And then you count forward 10 business days. You skip weekends, you skip state holidays because there's a state law. So, for example, President's Day, right? It's federal law, it's not a state law. So you wouldn't use that in calculating 10 days, but you count 10 days forward. And that 10th day from day 0, the date you received it, is when a response is due. And in order to comply with the law, right, we enforce the law, so we need to comply with it. It's pretty important that we comply with it as public records officers ourselves. I put that due date on multiple things, on my day planner, on my computer, on a calendar, so I know when all these APRAs are due, and I have redundancies too, so other people know when they're due, just so that we don't miss a deadline and therefore violate the APRA. Which is, those 10 days run by quickly. And if it's a complicated APRA request, you might need an extension. But what's key about this is you can't just have a boilerplate extension letter and you say, 10 days are up, I need to send an extension letter, and then send out some boilerplate letter that you have. You have to articulate the reasons why you're extending it. And it's pretty easy because when I have an easy APRA request, it's easy for me to respond to it within the 10 business days. There's something all the time, there's something about that APRA request that requires me to seek an extension. It's voluminous. There are a number of other pending requests. I had to get through all those, and now this one's due. You need to articulate that in the response and send it to the requester. So is it a public record? I touched on this a little bit. Anything that's created in your course of business as a member of a public body. So as I said, I'm constantly creating public records. Every day I go to the office, every post-it note I write, every email, every document, every submission, those are all public records, and then they're subject to the APRA. In connection with official business, if I'm writing a note at home about the Red Sox off season, it has nothing to do with my job as a Special Assistant Attorney General. It's not a public record. So is it maintained? This can get quirky for sometimes. So sometimes we have places where we store records, right? So I'm at the Attorney General's office. We get criminal cases constantly. We have a history of criminal prosecutions, also civil cases too, and we have a number of records. It would be impossible for us to store all of those in-house at 180 and 150 South Main Street in Providence. So we have Iron Mountain. Iron Mountain, their business is storing records for us. Because it's off-site and it's a private business, I can't say that the Attorney General's office no longer maintains that record, because we do. Even though it's held by a private business, they're holding it for us. So that's still being maintained by my office as a public body, regardless of the fact that it isn't on the premises. So, and this is something that I struggle with when I'm trying to respond to APRA requests. You need to conduct a reasonable search. So the classic show from the aughts here, The West Wing. So if the request was, say, for notes and correspondence in connection with a speech that Jed Bartlett delivered, there are a number of places there where you should search. There are books in the back behind CJ. There's notes in Toby's hand. And there's also, you need to ask these people too. So what I do is I usually know where the records are stored. If I have access to them, I search them myself. If I don't have access to them, if it's a criminal division record, I'm not a criminal attorney, they don't give me access to criminal records, I ask the admins at the criminal division to search those records. I ask the prosecutors who handle the case, do you know if these records exist? And you have to shake the tree as hard as you can, and ask as many people and search as many reasonable places that you can, to assure yourself that you don't maintain those records, or you do. So you need to think about all the possible places in which those records may be kept, and you need to exhaust that process. So those are all the possible places you can look for records. So I think I mentioned this. You don't have to provide summaries. You don't have to do data entry. It's the records as they're maintained in their regular form. The key here, and this is what I alluded to in answering questions that may be provided to you, the APRA is a floor. It's not a ceiling. So the statute sets forth the very basics of what you should do, what you have to do to comply with the law. But you want to do more. We want to try to be as transparent as possible in public service. So if you can provide more, you'll never get in trouble under the APRA for providing more than the statute says. You'll never get in trouble under the APRA for answering questions if they're provided to you. So always try to err on the side of transparency to the extent that you can, and you'll never get in trouble for being more transparent than not. So you need to provide a reasonably segregable portion of the records. So to an example here, we have a consumer protection division. Our consumer protection division receives complaints, usually about businesses, on a regular basis. Those complaints are filled with publicly identifiable information about individuals, their addresses, their phone numbers, their email accounts. Sometimes I saw one the other day, bank account information. So just because that information is in there, that doesn't make it exempt from public disclosure, because you're able to redact that information. And that's what I do in response to requests for consumer complaints. I carefully redact those complaints, make sure all that personally identifiable information is redacted out of it, and then I provide the records. However, remember, under the APRA, the requester only gets 1 free hour. If you cannot complete the request within that first free hour, you may seek prepayment. I'll probably touch on this a little bit later. You may seek prepayment, $15 an hour, for every hour above that first free hour it takes to fulfill the request. And redacting documents is part of that. So if I have 30 pages of consumer complaints, it'll take me 2 hours to redact all that information. I'm not going to likely redact all that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to seek prepayment for those 2 hours that it'll take me to redact the document, send that out instead of a response, and then await payment. And then if I receive payment, then I'll complete the request. But there are a number of exemptions. There are a lot of them. We can't go through all of them in this short presentation. But there's some common ones that I just want to go on. So, for example, I would say that although the APRA is a good law, it's probably the least efficient way to obtain records, because you have to think about, if I'm providing someone a record through the APRA process, it's public to one is public to all. So I need to think, I'm going to give this record to you, but it's the equivalent of going out on Greenwich Avenue and handing it out to people who walk by, because you're providing, it needs to be the same response. It's public to one's public to all. So that's why Exemption E is here. If you couldn't get this document through the criminal or civil discovery process, why should you be able to get it through the APRA? That wouldn't make any sense. So the APRA is a very carefully written law to account for the fact that it shouldn't be an end run around other processes. So if you can't get in discovery, you're not going to get it through the APRA process. Drafts, non-final documents, working papers, notes, things of that nature. It makes sense. It's not a final product. It's deliberation. And that deliberation, if I knew that all my drafts of all the things that I file in court were going to be public records, then it would hinder my ability to draft those documents, because I think that my prior thoughts about how to deal with the matter would be out there in the public. So Exemption K is there so that it doesn't chill that ability for you to work through drafts. So just remember, if a document is submitted at a public meeting, obviously you're waiving any protections there because you're publishing it to the public. So why could you then say that it's exempt from public disclosure if you already present it at a public meeting? Keep that in mind. Investigatory records. I tried to tailor this to the crowd. So if an individual may have violated a rule or a statute, and there's an investigation about that, and you have records with respect to that, obviously those shouldn't be public records until, but if a final action has been taken, and that the facts and circumstances are already public, then this protection, there may be other exemptions that apply, but this protection goes away. So this is, again, so that you don't circumvent other laws. HIPAA, for example, right? HIPAA provides very strong protection with respect to healthcare information. So you shouldn't be able to get records about healthcare information through the APRA. It wouldn't make sense. So exemption S is here. Any federal laws or state laws that state specifically these records are not public, therefore they're not public through the APRA. This is for the school folks. Any individually identifiable evaluations of public school employees made pursuant to state law, federal law, or regulation. And then personally identifiable information. This is stuff that's, I'll show you. This is stuff that's public by default. So I work for the state. All this information with respect to me is public information. But my home address, my phone number, my email, things of that nature are not public. And then there's a balancing test. So you need to, if it's tricky as to whether a certain document may hinder someone's privacy interests, if there's an overriding public interest in that information, sometimes the public interest in the disclosure of this information, it outweighs the privacy interests to such a large extent that it renders the document public. And that's another kind of tricky area of the law. But say there's something in the news that's just, that concerns schools, and there's, even though there's some privacy interests as to the document, there's so much at stake with respect to this issue that disclosure of that information outweighs any potential privacy violations that would come about through disclosure of those records. As a private citizen, the privacy interest is at its apex. I'm not a private citizen. I'm a public servant. Obviously, my documents, my information would be more apt to public disclosure than, say, someone who worked for a private corporation. This is, again, part of the balancing test. So sometimes you get requesters that don't have email. I have a lot of those requesters, folks at the ACI requesting documents. You may assess a photocopying charge, as I said, $15 per hour for work on these APRA requests with the first hour free. We try to email them because then it's not a cost for the requester. Again, we're trying to be transparent as possible. So again, if there's any costs incurred in fulfilling an APRA request, it's borne by the requester. One good example for this, oftentimes folks seek voluminous records. We get a lot of APRA requests about the Station nightclub fire. And there's a number of public documents at this point, going on 20 years now since that, over 20 years. So we have a number of public documents, but folks, they'll ask for everything, basically. We have it already, but we can't email it to them. It would be inefficient to photocopy everything, so we need to put it on a thumb drive. What we do is we send a prepayment estimate. We say the thumb drive will cost $10. Send us a check for $10. We'll send you the documents. That's an example of that. cost of redaction borne by the requester. If you have a requester, I know there are a few out there, you might be familiar with them. They request a number of documents, make a number of requests all the time. You get a request a week, right? Well, that 1 free hour, it's per 30 days. So if you've exhausted the first free hour in fulfilling a request and that same requester comes back a week later, you can basically instantly seek prepayment because they've already exhausted their first free hour. So although it may not seem like it, the law is written in a way so that to try to ease the burden on the public records officer so they're not constantly responding to APA requests. Sometimes it feels better in theory than in practice, but that is helpful. So if you're like my example, you're waiting for that prepayment for the thumb drive, that when you send out that prepayment letter, or for the $15 per hour cost redaction, that the time to respond to the request stops. It's told. I have a number of requests. I sent out the prepayment letter. We never hear from them again. Didn't violate the APRA by not providing them with the records because the time to respond is told until they provide a check. And then we include language in there that after 30 days, we'll close their request if they don't prepay, but they're free to submit a new request. The key is to try to communicate with the requester as best you can to provide what they need. And then I get a lot of questions about this. So basically, the requester can ask for documents in whatever form they want. I know this is a concern if they request it in a Word as opposed to a PDF, and then they could maybe edit the document, and that's a concern that folks have. But I will promise you that I have never seen a situation where someone has received a document through an APA request and then has edited it somehow for their own purposes. It's a concern sometimes. I get it. There are safeguards. If it's a real concern, you can put a draft a watermark on the document, things of that nature. But I've never encountered a situation where someone has manipulated a document that they've received through the APA process. So we use the word denial. It's kind of a term of art, though, because denial means a number of things. Denial means you're not getting the records because they're exempt from public disclosure, but it also means we just don't have the records. So the term denial, don't think of it as like you're actually denying records. It's basically that for some reason or another, the requester isn't getting the records that they sought. And it could be just as simple as we don't have the records. And then the denial must be in writing. So if someone requests something outlandish, you don't have it, you still have to tell them we don't have the records. You can't just silence doesn't under the APRA isn't right with respect to a denial. You need to articulate that in writing that you don't have the records. And they can appeal. They can appeal that denial. Regardless if you're just saying we don't have it, they can still appeal. They appeal to the chief administrative officer of the public body. For me, they appeal my decision to the attorney general. So whoever your chief administrative officer is, and then there's a 10 business day response time where that chief administrative officer reviews your work and either makes a different determination. And sometimes, believe it or not, the chief administrative officer will come out differently. So I talk to folks who are upset with how the APRA process turned out when they're requesters. I'd say, hey, you might as well appeal it. You might get a different response when a second set of eyes are looking at it, and oftentimes that's the case. It's this exact paragraph, and we put it in every response. And so I would say if you're a public records officer, just have a paragraph like that ready and include it in every response. And as I said, it goes to the chief administrative officer. Communicate with the requester. If you communicate with the requester, if there's an issue, it minimizes the chance that it comes to my office as a complaint, and that's key. And oftentimes, when we receive a complaint, and we open the complaint process, it forces the public body and the requester to communicate, and oftentimes complaints are withdrawn just due to that communication. So it's really key. I would say that don't shut off communication once that APRA request comes in. try to clarify, try to satisfy the requester to the extent that you can. Our website has a number of great resources for the APRA. We'll go right into the Open Meetings Act. I'll leave plenty of time for questions. I know I probably have a lot of questions about the Open Meetings Act. So again, it's about transparency. So the default position, if you're a public body, the default position is that your meetings are open. That's the default position. And you need to try to limit as much as you can having a closed meeting, which is executive session. We'll get into that because we want to be as transparent as possible in government. On the surface, it seems pretty Spartan what's required of the OMA. Open meetings, limited reasons for an executive session, notice, annual notice. That's really, I won't spend too much time on it. That's just pushing out when your meetings will be for the year. I've never seen, very rarely, if ever, have seen complaints about that. Supplemental, that's another word for agenda. A lot of complaints about that. A lot of findings from our office about that. We'll get into that. And also meeting minutes. You're required to draft and publish meeting minutes for the meetings. Much like the APRA, again, the OMA, it's a foundation. So you can always be more transparent, and you should be. This is just the bare bones, what's required of you under the statute. So, most of the answers to the OMA that I give to members of the public when they call me is going back to the basics. Does the OMA apply? There needs to be three things. Are you a public body? Is there a quorum of your public body? Are you discussing substantive business that is within your jurisdiction as a public body? One of those elements is missing, the OMA doesn't apply, and I can stop talking right now. You won't violate the OMA if one of those elements are missing. Less than a quorum, that's fine. If you send less of a quorum of your public body, and they can do whatever they want, because a meeting has never taken place, the OMA doesn't apply, you can't possibly violate the OMA because that element is out of there. So we'll get into all this a little bit more. This is, I'll repeat this, this is not the most clear-cut part of the statute. Is it a public body? It's a multi-factor test. There's a number of things that need to be considered. For example, I would say that if you have a entity and you have meetings, and those meetings aren't regular, you meet 3 times in 1 month, and you don't meet again for 4 months, and then you meet 5 times the next month, and then every time you have a meeting, different people show up who are part of that group, that would lead my office to generally consider that not to be a public body. But if there are other factors at play that render it a public body, then it might slide more to that side. So it's not clear cut. The advice I give is, because it takes a while for my office to draft an advisory opinion to make a determination as to whether you're subject to the OMA. When in doubt, just comply with the OMA. You won't get in trouble for doing that. So, no bright line test, that's what I was. So, quorum, again, very simple. A quorum is a simple majority of your public body. Your public body has 7 members, 4 constitutes a quorum. Your public body has 5 members, 3 constitute a quorum. So again, so much of this is answered by just going back to the foundations of the OMA. Is it a public body? Is it a quorum? Are they discussing issues that are within their bailiwick as a public body? Be careful about rolling quorums or walking quorums. What this is if you have less than a quorum, but that less than a quorum, say it's 2 members, 7-member public body, those 2 members engage in a conversation, and then through a conduit, provide all that information that was discussed to 2 more members without the other members involved. That constitutes a rolling quorum, where in effect, because of that sharing of information between 2 entities that are less than a quorum, it constitutes a quorum. That's the one little wrinkle here. If you have a rolling quorum, that can be violative of the OMA. The 2 groups that are less than quorums, if this was less than a quorum, this was less than a quorum, and I sat here, I discussed an issue and then came over to this table and let them know everything that we just discussed. I was that, even though I'm not a part of the public body, I was just a conduit between the two, and I formed a rolling quorum between those two groups. We have had a number of violations, not a number, but I'd say that this is something that people aren't necessarily aware of. So if you have this is a classic example. A member of the public body posts something about their public body on Facebook. Then a quorum of members comment on that in the comment section of the social media post. You just violated the OMA because you have all three elements. You have a public body. You have a quorum engaging in a conversation. They're discussing something that's within their control and supervision as a public body. Those three elements are present. That's a closed meeting, and that violates the OMA. Same thing if you have any kind of app or Google document, things that multiple people can all work on at the same time, that violates the OMA. And we have a number of findings about that. So what's a meeting? You need to discuss something over which you have supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. So if you have a quorum of your public body and you meet and all you discuss is the Patriots, unless you're a public body that you have control over the Patriots, would be great. I'd want to be part of that public body, but I don't think they exist. But so if you do that, that's not violating the OMA, because that third goes back to the basics. That third leg of the three-legged stool is not present. Keep in mind, though, the optics of that. If you go to Dunkin' Donuts and you're a quorum of a public body and recognizable to the community that you serve, and a member of the community sees you, they see a quorum of a public body communicating, the optics of that aren't good. And it leads, imaginations can run wild and the public can think that you're discussing substantive business, or things can slip and you're discussing the Patriots and all of a sudden you start discussing the business of your public body. And all of a sudden you have an OMA violation. So even though you might not have, and you have safeguards to prevent a violation of the letter of the law, I would say the optics are terrible, and it's basically a violation of the spirit of the law, because it doesn't present well as a public body. So just be wary of that. During the COVID-19 pandemic, folks were Zooming into meetings with respect to the public body. But you have to keep in mind, the OMA was written when Zoom and the platforms that we have weren't available or weren't as efficient as they are now. So at the time that the statute was written, it wasn't imagined that we'd have such great technology. And so the statute states that the members of the public body need to be in person. They cannot Zoom in, they cannot call in. The members of the public body itself need to be in person at the meeting. Now, you can open it up to Zoom for other people to observe. You can do public comment through Zoom. You can have speakers come in through Zoom. The members of the public body itself, they need to be present. There's a minor exception to that. If one of your members is active duty in the United States Armed Services, they can participate remotely. Also, if an individual has a disability that requires them to enter the meeting remotely, I would think maybe if you're immunocompromised with respect to COVID-19, that would be one potential reason. My office is, at least I'm not an expert with respect to disabilities and what qualifies and what doesn't qualify. So we defer to the Governor's Commission with respect to disabilities to speak to that as to whether a disability qualifies such that a member of the public body can participate remotely. You can schedule a meeting. I don't know if I put this slide up here, but you can schedule a meeting remotely, but you can't. That's about all you can do. Yep, members of the public must be physically present. Executive session, big topic. So, again, the default position, every meeting by default is public, and there are very limited reasons as to why you can convene into executive session, and that needs to be set forth in your agenda. So we'll get into this. Again, there are a number of reasons why a public body can convene into executive session. In the interest of time, and so I can get to questions, I'll just touch on some of the most frequent ones. So, discussion of job performance or the character of a person or persons. So, if you're discussing, Joe or Jane's performance with respect to your public body, that gets into non-public information that probably wouldn't be polite for that to be discussed publicly, right? That's something for your public body to determine in a closed session. However, that person, they may request that it be discussed publicly at a public forum, and that's why there's some wrinkles with respect to this one. That there needs to be advance written notice. That's going to happen to the affected person. They may request that this be discussed publicly, and the public body needs to state an open call that they complied with this provision of the OMA. Collective bargaining, litigation. Again, if your public body is getting sued or is involved in litigation, you don't want to discuss litigation strategy at a public meeting. Then defense counsel or the plaintiff's counsel attends that public meeting. They have your entire litigation strategy. There goes your case, right? So it makes sense. Collective bargaining, or you're entering into contract negotiations. Again, this is information that's not something you want the public to be to know of, because then it gets to the other side, and then it's not advantageous to you. However, what you can do is you can bring experts into this closed session with you. So obviously, if it's litigation, your attorney can come into executive session with you to discuss litigation, and it's impacting your public body. This is not something that you want to discuss publicly. This is specific to school committees. School committee sessions to conduct student disciplinary hearings or to review other matters relating to the privacy of students or their records. So take this one specifically into account. This is in the OMA statute. And when you create your agenda for your public body, obviously your agenda is going to be very detailed with respect to your regular items that you're going to discuss. Think of it this way, right? Members of the public want to know what changes may happen, what things will be put in place that impact their children or students in their community. So if you have a very vague agenda topic, for example, we found OMA violations for terms such as good and welfare or old business or new business. If you just simply put on the agenda something that says new business, and then under new business, you discuss something that has a great impact to students in your community, but no one knew about it, right? Because the agenda said old business. So how are you supposed to know what the public body was going to be discussing? And that greatly impacts people. So you need to have detailed agenda topics that specifically set forth what you're going to be discussing. Executive session's different. You still need to notice it. It still needs to be on your agenda, but you can't provide all the detail as to what you're going to discuss because it's a closed session. So I advise people, you want to get as close, you want to discuss and you want to draft it in such a way that you provide as much detail as possible in the executive session notice without defeating the entire purpose of having an executive session. And generally speaking, if you do that, you're in compliance with the OMA, so with the executive session. So you just have a brief description of why the public body is convening into executive session, and then cite specifically to the statute, the part of the OMA statute, this is all on our website, that justifies your public body convening into executive session. Cite to the statute, describe what you're going to discuss. Public notice. As I mentioned, there's two types of public notice. There's annual and supplemental. Annual we won't touch on. It's not something that I see a lot of complaints about. People don't really argue about annual notice. It's a supplemental notice. This is big. This is your agenda. It must be posted 48 hours in advance of your meeting, excluding weekends and state holidays. Again, this is so that the public knows what's going on. If you posted an agenda 2 hours before the meeting and it was something that a member of the public wants to be privy to, and they miss it because they're working, they need childcare, then that greatly impacts them, and they're not able to be aware of what's going on. So that's why this part of the statute's in there. There's the agenda, supplemental notice is also the agenda, needs to be posted in 3 places: Secretary of State's website, the office of the public body, and another highly visible location within the public entity where someone can access the agenda. So most people just go to the Secretary of State's website for the agenda. That's key. But keep in mind, the statute also requires physical posting. A lot of people aren't tech savvy, so they need that physical posting in order to know what's going on. We won't stick to annual again. Supplemental, it's pretty Spartan. Date, time, and location of the meeting, date posted, and a statement specifying the nature of the business to be discussed. I get a lot of questions. Oh, we had to change the meeting location, and the meeting's tomorrow, but the agenda says a different location. Is that okay? It's not okay. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. When in doubt, it's inconvenient. It's better to cancel the meeting than violate the OMA. But that's a quick fix. If folks from the public body get to me or they have a question about that, that's a quick fix. You cancel the meeting, you reschedule so that there's proper notice. This statement specifying the business to be discussed, I'm foot stomping this one because there's a lot of complaints about this. This is where vague agenda items get a public body into trouble. This is the test. Whether the public notice provided the public body fairly informed the public under the totality of the circumstances of the nature of the business to be discussed. It's fact specific. It takes into account the specificity of the agenda item, relation of the agenda item to the topics of discussion, and whether notice is given of any action. So that's key. So the action item, there have been violations where the public body says they're going to discuss something, but they don't specify that they're going to vote on it. So say they're going to hire someone, right? The agenda says we are going to discuss hiring a new employee, but they forgot to put on the agenda that they're going to actually vote and hire that employee. So remember, the public sees that. They're like, well, they're just going to discuss it. They're not going to vote. I don't need to show up. But that action item was missing. The vote and the hiring, that was missing, and that happened at the public body, at the meeting. That's been found by the Supreme Court, not just us, to violate the OMA. These are agenda items here that we have found. These have all violated the OMA. This is an agenda item, President's Report, Good and Welfare. This was an agenda item that was submitted by a public body, and then it was fair game to discuss basically carte blanche under that topic, and the public wasn't fairly informed as to what was being discussed. It doesn't apply to you. So public bodies may amend the agenda at the meeting. So if an item wasn't on your agenda, you with a majority vote, not school committees though, can vote and add an item, but because you're adding it at last minute, there's very limited things that you can do. You can basically just discuss the issue. You can't take any action on it. This doesn't apply to school committees. You'll find with respect to the law, there are a lot of things that there are special rules that impact specifically school committees. I think that's because of the interests of what school committees do, in the interest of students. There's a lot more care involved in making sure the public is properly notified. So school committees are limited with respect to areas where other public bodies would have more wiggle room with the law. I would say I can't speak to them all extemporaneously. Speak to your solicitor if you have any questions about this. There aren't any, this is the biggest one, but there's some other quirky ones you might want to know about. So the agenda may be amended. These are the rules, though. It needs to be submitted in writing by a member of the public during public comment and for informational purposes only. So it's very limited, and that's how it applies to school committees. Emergency meetings, you can have them. You can do it, but it's very limited. This is basically saying there's an emergent issue, you need to discuss it immediately, but basically you need to just limit the topics of discussion on the emergent issues themselves, and then you need to basically take steps. You can't take a lot of action. You need to only take action with respect to the emergent circumstances. And then you have to post the notice and agenda as quickly as possible, because you're not complying with the OMA, but you want the public to be quickly informed of what you're discussing. Public comment. I get a lot of questions, not so much from the public bodies, but from the members of the public. They say, I was denied the opportunity to provide public comment at the meeting. They cut me off. Well, the public body has carte blanche with respect to public comment. You don't have to have it. You can cut it off at any time. And members of the public are surprised when I tell them that. And I get a lot of complaints. They think they've written this perfect complaint that's going to be opened up against the public body because they were denied public comment. Well, the statute doesn't, under the OMA at least, the OMA itself, there's no right to public comment. There may be other statutes at play that require public comment, but I don't have, as the Attorney General's office doesn't have jurisdiction over those. So if I got a complaint about denial of public comment, there's nothing we can do about it. It's not within our jurisdiction. Now this is key, because say that you do have public comment, someone raises an issue that wasn't on the agenda. You can address that topic, you can speak to that topic, but this has been where OMA violations have been found. You can't then use that as a means to pivot onto another topic, an unrelated topic that wasn't properly noticed, and then opine on that topic. And so you need to, if you're a member of the public body and a member of the public raises a question to you, your answer needs to be strictly in response to that topic. You can't then address other issues that weren't on the agenda. Minutes, it's very limited requirements here. Date, time, place of the meeting, records of any votes taken, who was absent, who was present, other relevant information. So if you're a member of you want something that, it's the kind of, what you hear often, I would like the record to reflect. So that's a member of the public body requesting that something be in the minutes, and that needs to be in the minutes as well. And they need to be disclosed to the public within 35 days. If you're a public body, the public body there's official minutes and unofficial minutes. Unofficial minutes are your draft minutes. Official minutes are the minutes that have been voted upon and approved by the public body. Some form of those need to be posted within 35 days. So a lot of public bodies, they're not meeting within 35 days. They're not able to approve their minutes. Then your draft minutes, at least for the OMA's purposes, become your official minutes. You post them on a Secretary of State's website. Again, go back to transparency. In the interest of transparency, you want the public to know what was discussed, so the minutes need to be up there within 35 days. Goes without saying, but should still say it. The ADA applies. Make sure public meetings are accessible to members of the public with disabilities. Our website has a number of information on respect to that, in respect to the OMA. So I was able, this is a 3-hour presentation that I did. I did in about 50 minutes. So, happy to take any questions you may have. Special rules for the General Assembly that are not not the same as a public body, as to the OMA. I'm sure I can't speak to that specifically, but there are a number of laws and rules and provisions that apply to the General Assembly that kind of make them different than other public bodies.
We have always had a policy that the school committee doesn't comment or respond to that person's whatever they had to say. Now, did you contradict that, saying the school committee can't comment on what is presented in public forum?
You have no obligation to respond to public comment.
Now, is it the chair, or can any member of the committee respond?
Any member of the committee, I mean, you may have internal rules that govern your public body. That's outside the scope of the OMA. But if a member of the public asks a question, I imagine any member of the public body can respond to that question. What they can't do is start talking about a topic that's outside the scope of the question that was delivered.
We always say ahead of time that open forum, you may present situations, but we are not in a position to comment.
I just have a follow-up to that. I've now talked to like 5 different education lawyers. None of them want us answering, right? Because I think the danger is that rolling into another topic is just too easy. So that question comes up all the time because you get this that says it's okay, but then I haven't yet met a lawyer that says go ahead and answer. So I don't know if anybody else has had a different experience.
I just wanted to clarify what our policy and what you just said was, it looked to me like it was in conflict, and I don't want to be in conflict.
I think the danger part is the part that they're helping us with, right? So, yeah. Don't put your foot in stage.
Yes, sir.
More than just one committee member can start talking about that public comment. As long as we stay on point, no bold statements, so we talk and answer their questions.
Yeah, so the question is, if a member of the public asks a question, which members of the public body can respond? I don't see anything contrary to the law that any member of the public body can respond to that question. You may be governed by internal rules as to who, that's outside the scope of the OMA. That's maybe a question for a parliamentarian, but as to the OMA, anyone can respond. So, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. So that's a good question. The question is about whether accompanying documents need to be included as part of the agenda when it's posted on the Secretary of State's website. Now, the agenda itself should set forth the business properly without needing to rely on any external documents. The reason for that is, I don't know if they have the ability to now, but I know in the past the Secretary of State's website can only upload the agenda. They can't upload accompanying documents. So if that, you need a sufficient statement of the business to be discussed. And this has been problematic for public bodies in the past where they say, we're not going to really set forth what we're going to discuss on the agenda itself, but if you read this document, then you'll know what we're going to discuss. That doesn't comply with the OMA because the Secretary of State's office doesn't have the ability to upload that document. And if it's a voluminous document, you need to print like a 80 to 100 page document, and that needs to be posted at your principal place of business as well as another place within the public body, and it also has to be uploaded on the Secretary of State's website. So what you should do instead is just draft an agenda that properly states what you're going to discuss, and then any accompanying documents, I would just have them available if you really need them, but it's not required as part of the notice process for the OMA. I don't know the extent to which you use documents at a public meeting, but if they're provided openly at the meeting, I would say that any APRA requests for those, it would be difficult to exempt them from public disclosure because you've basically already published them.
Generally put on a screen. That's how we do it.
Adam, I've got one, someone asked me to ask this, they had to leave. Groundbreaking
Check.
houses that have a majority of the school committee, do they have to be posted as meetings?
So this is again where, when in doubt, I go down to the foundation of the OMA. Quorum, public body,
check.
discussion
Check.
of substantive business. So again, this is something where, maybe you might not violate the letter of the law. If you have a quorum of a public body and they're just standing there and not saying anything, under the letter of the law, you're not violating the OMA. But the optics aren't good, especially if sometimes members of the public body, I hope you all get along, you start talking to each other, and then if you start talking to each other, right, and a member of the public sees that, and they think that you're discussing substantive business, you could potentially at least get a complaint. And I would say that superficially, if I'm reviewing that, I would say it would be enough for my office to probably open up a complaint, because we'd need to figure out what you were talking about. So I try to advise public bodies to send less than a quorum to events, because that way you're not going to violate the OMA.
We got one, maybe two more questions. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Technically, we have a number of quorums in this room, and none of our districts have posted no meetings.
Well, you can pretend that I wasn't here for that part, but I will analogize. There have been court cases involving public bodies where the public body has had to go to court. The public body has both been in court and been hosting a public body at the same time, because because under the OMA they're having a meeting. So they posted notice. They did everything they would with respect to an open meeting, even though it took place at Providence Superior Court, because the OMA applied. Now, we're not discussing your substantive business of your public body here. We're discussing how to comply with the law. I would argue that I hope we don't get a complaint about this, but if we did, it would be like, we've got two of the elements here that are present. We've got quorums and we've got public bodies. Are we discussing your business or your public body? Not really. We're discussing how to comply with the law. So.
What we did,
Well, you don't have to if you're less than a quorum, because the OMA doesn't apply. But again, open meetings laws are always, you want to be as transparent as possible. So if you can post the minutes, why don't you just post the minutes? You're informing the public, which is always a good thing.
Let's give Erin the last question.
I just want to do a follow-up on that one. For subcommittee meetings, if you're sending, say, if your quorum's 3 and you send 2, where does that fall in as far as OMA goes?
Say that again?
Sorry, subcommittee meetings
Yep.
of the school committee, if you're just sending 2 school committee members, where does that fall in as far as OMA?
If it's less than a quorum, the OMA doesn't apply. So if it's less than a quorum, yeah, the OMA doesn't apply. There needs to be a quorum for the OMA to apply.
Adam, thank you.